So let us discuss public international law. Okay. So let before we discuss the nitty gritty of public international, I think let's it's good that we consider discussing in, its introduction and some preliminary considerations when it comes to public international law. Okay. So what is public international law? Okay. So public international law is the branch of public law which regulates the relations of states and of other entities which have been granted an international personality. So, of course, that's the definition by Justice Cruz in his book citing Hackworth and Schwarzenberger. Then, then, of course, public international law is the body of legal rules, norms, and standards that apply between sovereign states and other entities that are legally recognized as international actors. So this is the classic definition of Jeremy Bentham when it comes to public international law. Actually, the concept of if you're going to read further, when we speak of law of nations, this is more or less coined by Jeremy Bentham. Of course, we know also that Jeremy Bentham is not just legal does not is not just this as important in your international law. Note that Jeremy Bentham is one of the founders of the positivist theory. Okay, so insofar as legal philosophy is concerned, it is Jeremy Bentham and some of his contemporaries who introduced the concept of the positive rule. Okay, all right, then of course we have to distinguish the concept of public international law with respect to the concept of international committee as well as the concept of conflicts of law or private international law. Okay, so of course, international law is distinct from international committee, which comprises legally non-binding practices adopted by states for reasons of courtesy. So, for example, the saluting of flags of foreign warships at sea, this constitute international committee. So committee emphasizes politeness among states as well as non-state actors. Then, of course, in addition to the study of international law or public international law, we have to distinguish it with conflicts of laws or private international law. So, private international law or conflicts of law would concerns with the rules of municipal law. Of course, as international lawyers, the term is the domestic law of the states of different countries where foreign elements are involved. So, private international law is part of municipal law dealing with the determination of whether a factual situation involving a foreign element of the law of the another state shall be applied. Then it concerns private affairs of persons and not of states. So, I think you would have encountered this in your conflicts of law subject. So, although it has international favor because there is an interplay between two laws of different states. You have to distinguish this with public international because public international is more or less binding norms or practices or agreements among the law among states. So that's why, of course, as I said, the Bentham definition, there is this concept of this constitutes the law of nations. Okay, but in private international law, we discuss different domestic laws or different municipal laws and how would it involve insofar as private affairs are concerned. So if you can recall applicability of contracts or applicability of rules, then there is sometimes this issue of there is a need for a renvoi, di ba? Or there is this lex situs or lex loci celebrationis, all of those principles which would consider as conflicts provisions. Okay, so that's the difference between your public international law and private international law. Okay, then of course we have to also distinguish international law with the concept of international relations. So of course, international relations is more of the bigger scope of the discussion. International law is but a distinctive part of that general structure of international relations. So In contemplating responses to a particular international situation, states usually consider relevant international laws. Although considerable attention is invariably focused on violations of international law, states generally are careful to ensure that their actions conform to the rules and principles of international law because acting otherwise would be regarded negatively by the international community. So the rules of international law are rarely enforced by military means or even by the use of economic sanctions. Instead, the system is sustained by the reciprocity or a sense of enlightened self-interest. States that breach international rules suffer a decline in credibility that may prejudice them in future relations with other states. So, thus, a violation of a treaty by one state to its advantage may induce other states to breach other treaties and thereby cause harm to the original violator. Furthermore, it is generally realized that consistent rule violations would jeopardize the value that the system brings to the community of states, international organizations, and other actors. So this value consists in the certainty, predictability, and sense of common purpose in international affairs that derives from the existence of a set of rules accepted by all international actors. Then, international law also provides a framework and a set of procedures for international interaction as well as a common set of concepts for understanding it. Okay. Now, of course, we have to discuss the schools of thought. Of course, there would always be these three schools of thought. Of course, we have the naturalist and the positive school. I think you have already heard this not only in international law, but in philosophy of law in general. So this is usually the main tug of war of schools. So it's the naturalist versus the positive. As we all know, when we speak of the naturalist school, insofar as PIL is concerned, they believe the naturalist would sought to adhere to the principle that international law is based on those rules of conduct discoverable by every individual in his own conscience and through the application of the right reason, as he is bound to observe these rules without need of a formal or external prescription. So too is the state, which is composed of individuals. So of course, this is more on natural law. I think this you would have realized this. This is in relation to the naturalists like Aristotle, St. Thomas Aquinas. These are more or less on the natural school. Then we have the positivist school of thought. So this is the positivist kind of had this that had this niche starting, as I said, with Jeremy Bentham. Okay, then it evolved into other schools of thought. So if you would have heard Kelsen, we would have heard Hart. Okay, those are more or less positivist. Okay, so of course, what is the positivist school? So international is based on the consent of states and on such consent only. So this consent is expressed in the case of treaty or conventional law, implied in the case of customary law, and presumed in the case of general principles. Then, of course, we have the eclectic or the Grotian school. So this is actually the main niche of public international law. Of course, if you have heard of Hugo Grotius, of course, Hugo Grotius is considered as the father of international law. As for, in some sectors, he's the father of modern international law. So remember that Grotius came at the time that there was this severe conflict in Europe. Okay, so of course the principles of Grotius. Okay, and of course this is not only insofar as the conflicts within Europe is concerned. Grotius was of course a lawyer. He was a lawyer in the Netherlands. So this was the time also that the Netherlands has been trying to establish their control over parts of the world. So if you can recall these stories about the Dutch East India Company, or if you see it in historical documentaries, they usually use this flag, the VOC, which is black and onto white. Okay, so the VOC, or practically what we know as the Dutch East India Company, this was a general company that has, as a blessing of the royal Dutch monarchy. but was allowed to enter into several agreement to enter into commercial transactions. But if you're going to look at it, it's just more than commercial transactions. It's more on not only commercial in nature, but also an implied way of doing conquest with other nations. So if we can recall the story of the Las Palmas case, okay, yung Las Palmas or Miangas case. Remember that there was this time what happened there was the Philippines then by the US because it happened during the American occupation. The Philippines want to lay claim on Miangas or Las Palmas Island, okay, which is actually, well, it is a territory down. It is an island that you can see if you're standing around, Davao City or in I think in Sarangani. So if you look far away there, you would see an island there. It's actually closer to the Philippines than anyone thought. And well, that island was occupied by natives who can speak actually Filipino, okay, or I think Visaya to be distinct. But what happened was the natives there, even before we were colonized by the Americans, okay. So around the 1700s, the Dutch has been doing trade negotiations with the native folk there at Las Palmas. Then eventually that relationship evolved into something that, well, the VOC suddenly, slowly, or through these agreements, it slowly converted it until eventually it was converted that Mangas become now part of the Dutch East Indies. Okay, because some of the agreements, they mix those agreements in order for those natives to recognize the authority of the Dutch monarchy. Okay, so they kind of did something. So what happened was, of course, when the Las Palmas case came up in the 1920s, the the Dutch, of course, by that time, Indonesia is still controlled by the Netherlands. Okay, so the Netherlands was able to to raise the defense successfully that they have already effective occupation of Las Palmas. Okay, they have effective occupation that despite the fact that we have territorial claims, and rightfully so because it's in the map, nonetheless, because of this effective occupation by the Dutch, practically by the Dutch, there is this concept that well, they cannot we cannot the Philippines cannot claim otherwise that it is now still part of the territory because the effective occupation of Las Palmas now belongs to the Dutch. Okay, so what does it drives us? Okay, so um this is how eclectic or the Grotian school will work. Okay, so of course it's a compromise between the first two schools of thought. So international law is binding because it's partly good and right, as well as it is partly consented and bound by the states. Okay, of course we have to link this eclectic or Grotian model later on to this concept of horizontality of PIL. Actually, the Las Palmas case is more or less an example of the concept of horizontality. Okay, so we have this concept of horizontality. Okay, so horizontal and then of course we're going to discuss the monist and dualist nature. Then of course the binding effects of international convention. So okay, let's discuss first about the horizontality of PIL. So how would we going to distinguish horizontality from verticality? Uh, Usually, states follow the vertical model. Okay, states follow the vertical model. So, for example, here in the Philippines, everything goes on an echelon. Okay, so for example, in the courts, our courts follow a vertical model. So you have a case, you file with the fiscal, let's say criminal case. You file with the fiscal, go up, probable cause, go to the trial court, be it an MTC or an RTC. Okay, then if there would be a verdict of guilty, you go up to appeal. You go up to the CA or the Sandigan Bayan, depending on the case. Then until you go up until the Supreme Court. So that's an example of the demonstration of the vertical model. Okay. Usually, municipal laws operate on a vertical model approach. Okay. So sometimes is there a possibility that in a municipal law there might be horizontal approaches. Actually, you can see it in your Senate hearings, although more or less they're not successful in theory. But like for example, of course, this is 2024. I think you're aware with the Quadcom hearings. Okay, so practically that's an example of how the Philippines having national laws can act as if they want to do something which is horizontal, okay? Which is they wanted to investigate, example, they want to investigate things in the Senate, then they're going to recommend cases, okay? Uh, Practically, it's more or less like that. But what's really also happening naman in theory also and in actual practice is if that happens, at the end of the day, the courts will always stick on the courts will always stick on the rules on evidence or the rules of court. Okay, so if there's not really any evidence aside from the Senate hearings, more or less the courts would still just adhere to what they see as evidence. They would still be they might still give a judgment of acquittal to those who might be recommended by the Senate. What I'm saying is doesn't necessarily mean that the Senate or Congress recommended that you be filed the case doesn't mean that you're already guilty, diba? Although that might have been the intended effect, but of course, at the end of the day, the courts would still pursue independently their decisions based on facts and the law, diba? So, of course, we still retain this vertical model. Now, what about international law? Now, international law, you would always see this concept of horizontal enforcement. Okay, so of course, the different enforceability structure of international law is effective by this way because the objective of international is markedly different to domestic law. So, for example, let's go back to the Las Palmas case. If we're going to use as basis the Treaty of Paris map, all of those documentations that are existing at the time of the Las Palmas case, you would be able to say that, well, the Philippines has the right because he has all the documentation, he has all the title, he has all the documentary features that may say that would buttress the claim that we own Las Palmas. But the arbiter there, the sole permanent, because the if you know if you can we can recall Las Palmas is a PCA case decided by a lone arbiter, si Max Huber. Okay, so Max Huber as the independent arbiter did not see the did not see deciding the case just sticking solely on the documentary pieces of evidence in favor of the US slash the Philippines. What what Max Huber did was he went into that wider concept of application of a horizontal enforcement. That is, okay, we have the documentation, but can't we consider the fact that the Netherlands has been occupying Las Palmas since the 1700s? Okay, so it might not be as vertical if you're going to apply it, if you're going to look at it in a documentary based approach, 'di ba? Like if you want to go in favor of the insofar as deciding Las Palmas, Max Huber more or less decided based on how are you going to decide the case. So he went into deciding the case as to the reckoning point of that right, 'di ba? That is why there is this concept of intertemporal doctrine in that Las Palmas case, because you do not have to concentrate on on the documentation per se, but you have to treat the overall situation. In treating the overall situation, you will come up with a more equitous or more 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 balanced or more reasonable way of deciding things. Okay, so of course, when we speak of horizontality, of course, why does PIL have to adhere with horizontal enforcement? So, of course, the purpose of international law is to influence and change state behavior, which is consistent in why it was created in the first place, which is to maintain international stability and order. So, unlike domestic law, international law is not preoccupied with deterrence. Instead of punishment and deterrence, international law aims to change how states interact with one another and also attempts to ensure that the interaction maintains certain standards. So international law codifies as law standards already in agreement between states, which consequently encourages more general state compliance with international law. So once the standards are then observed by a large number of states and remain consistent over time, the standards become norms and there is an expectation that all states are accountable. So aside from Las Palmas, of course, there are a lot of cases, most of them involving law on the sea. So, if you can recall all of the provisions of UNCLOS, most of those provisions, most of those provisions pertain to previous cases that were decided. Actually, they were already codified. Okay, but if you look at it in a jurisprudential sense, most of those statements in UNCLOS, most of those rules that was established for in UNCLOS, they are more or less, it started with an international case. So if you can recall the discussion on, I think, baselines or archipelagic baselines, and I think right of innocent passage, it's more or less discussed in the Corfu Channel case. Most of the doctrines in the Corfu Channel case, they were adopted in your, they were adopted in your, adopted in your UNCLOS. Okay. One another example is of course si Genocide Convention. If you would note yung discussion dun sa ICJ, yung ICJ advisory opinion on the Genocide Convention, most of the most if not all of the discussions or principles established in that request for advisory opinion, they are now in your Vienna Convention on the Law on Treaties. So most of the concepts on reservation, because remember that the ICJ opinion was done in 1951. The Vienna Convention on the Law on Treaties is a 1969 convention. Okay, so the concept in your Genocide Convention decision or advisory opinion request is more or less adopted in your VCLT. Okay, so then for example, or of another example would be your Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations and the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations. So these are more or less rules or principles or norms or customs which have already been established over time with respect to diplomacy. Okay, so of course diplomacy has been around even before we were born, even during the ye olde years of times of the knights and prince and kings and princesses, 'di ba? So more or less these are handed out from generation to generation, from centuries. So then here in our modern world, we have public international law. Some of these concepts are already adopted or already been codified or been assumed. Okay, so insofar as the modern take on PIL is concerned. Okay, all right. Then of course monist and dualist state. Okay, so of course we have heard this discussion actually. So what do we mean by monist versus dualist state? So this is more in relation to this concept of how would municipal law or national law would treat international law. Okay, in the monist theory, to cut it straight or cut it dry, when we speak of monist, if we're going to consider a state as monist, they believe that public international law is one and the same with with your municipal or your national law. So Monists accept that the internal and international legal systems form a unity. So both national legal rules and international rules that a state has accepted, for example by way of a treaty, determine whether actions are legal or illegal. Okay, that in a pure monist state, international does not need to be translated into national law. It is simply incorporated and has effect automatically in national or domestic laws. The act of ratifying an international treaty immediately incorporates the law into national law. Okay, so when we speak of the theory of the monist, it's already automatic. So your international law is one and the same with your domestic law. Okay, then what about the dual state? So a dual state, so of course, there's like still a recognition of international, but in a dual state, there is a requirement of the transposition of international law into municipal or national law. Without this, the international law does not exist as law. So international law was, as such, can confer no right recognizable in the municipal courts. So it is only insofar as the rules of international law are recognized as included in the rules of municipal law that are allowed in municipal courts to give rights to rights and obligations. So the question now is, what is the Philippines insofar as this monist versus dualist state discussion is concerned? So the Philippines is a dualist state. Okay, so why is it a dualist state? If you're going to look at your constitution, of course, there would still be deeper discussions on scholars. Okay, all right. So let's discuss first on the structure of the constitution. So, insofar as the constitution is concerned, number one, we have the incorporation clause. You would see this in your Article 2, Section 2 of your 1987 Constitution. So, in your incorporation clause, there is this acceptance of general principles of international as part of the law on the land. Now, of course, some would comment that even without this clause, the Philippines is bound to comply with the said general principles being part of the family of nations. Okay, but note that even in the reason why you can consider the Philippines as dualist is, note that most of the cases when it involves a general principle of international law, like for example, if you can recall the case of there is this case of I think this the case of Bautista versus Rino. Okay, there is this issue on the compliance with the traffic road signs under another Vienna Convention. Okay, so the Supreme Court held that we have to the law is part of our obligation to comply as part of the general principles of international law. But note that the compliance to the Vienna Convention and particularly in all other treaties, note that it's not the treaty that we're discussing that is part of the general principle. What we are saying as general principle is this concept of pacta sunt servanda. Because remember, if you enter into a treaty, you have this obligation to comply with your treaty obligations in good faith. Okay, so of course, pacta sunt servanda is one of the one of those established principles of international law. Okay, then of course we have the transformation clause. So our transformation clause, we have Article 7, Section 21 of your 1987 Constitution. So of course, when we speak of the transformation clause, there is this requirement of a ratification, particularly two-thirds of the vote of the Senate, before treaties may have binding force and effect. Then we have legislative powers of Congress, which may pass the necessary legislation adopting a PIL source so that it may be converted into municipal law. So now it's going to be binding with the state. So, for example, I think in the Quadcom hearings, if you can recall, there was this discussion that we already have a law which is RA 9851 insofar as making criminal international humanitarian crime. So practically, well, come to think of it, that was that even went before this was even I think drafted eh, before the EJK before or not EJK this was drafted even way before there was this issue on extra enforced disappearances, if you can recall, which prompted the Supreme Court to draft rules for the writ of amparo. Okay, but this was already existing at the time. So si RA 9851, which more or less we adhere to this principle of making criminal cases involving international humanitarian crimes. Okay? All right. So that's your legislative powers of Congress. Now, you should not be confused with this kasi some authors kasi would say that well if let's say the Supreme Court says that well this is part of our domestic law. Some would say that well it means that we might be monist. Okay? Note that, well, insofar as some authors would concede that the issue on monist and dualist actually does not really have this practical application. Because at the end of the day, courts would decide whether or not to apply an international rule or an international law principle. That is why, if you're going to ask me personally, we are the Philippines is really dualist because whatever happens, as long as there would be court determination, whether if it is going to be from the RTC or even directly to the Supreme Court by way of a certiorari, okay, there is still a determination. So it's still dualist in nature because if it is monist in nature, there is no need for the courts to interfere at any given rate. So you should comply with it, diba? You should comply with. You don't need for the if ever the courts will determine something, it's more or less not on whether or not should be rejected or accepted. It's more on whether or not it's legal or unconstitutional insofar as municipal or your domestic law is concerned. Okay, so there would be an attack on the constitutionality directly, but not necessarily that you have to distinguish it, 'di ba? You're going to treat it as if it's a law that you want to strike down, 'di ba? Like for example, there's an illegal provision in a certain law. You can do that in a treaty as if you're treating it as a law, okay, or an ordinance or a domestic issuance, okay? So, but as long as courts will interfere on determining whether or not that principle is applicable or the treaty is applicable, it just means that we are a dualist state because we ask the courts to interfere insofar as determining the appropriateness of such rule on PIL or such principle or such treaty or whatever that is. Okay, then then, of course, we have these cases. Of course, Ichong versus Hernandez, petitioner's argument that, of course, RA 180 violated the UN Charter and the UDHR would fail, as the UN Charter imposes no strict or legal obligations regarding the rights or freedom of their subjects, and the Declaration of Human Rights contains nothing more than a mere recommendation or a common standard of achievement for all peoples and all nations. Also, the law cannot be said to be void for supposed conflict with treaty obligations because no treaty has actually been entered into on the subject, and police power may not be curtailed or surrendered by any treaty or other conventional agreement. Actually, this is still holds true practically as latest as Pangilinan versus Cayetano, although it did not expressly cited Ichong. It is by implication stating that uh, our laws cannot be overrun or overstated by the treaty. I'm mentioning this insofar as the discussion on lex posterior derogat priori. Okay, so I think there's a discussion that's what I'm mentioning insofar as Ichong is still good jurisprudence. Okay, then in Garcia, of course, this involves the admission of a certain lawyer from Spain who wants to practice here in the Philippines. The Supreme Court did not allow this person because, of course, he's a Filipino, but he is practicing law in Spain. Of course, it is clear that the treaty, because he cited the treaty on academic degrees of professions between the Republic of the Philippines and Spain. Problem is, Garcia is a Filipino. It is discerned that said treaty was intended to govern Filipino citizens desiring to practice their profession in Spain and vice versa on and so far as citizens of Spain is concerned. Since the applicant is a Filipino citizen desiring to practice the legal profession here, he is subject to the laws of the Philippines and is not entitled to the privileges extended in the said treaty. So the aforementioned treaty could not have been intended to modify the rules and regulations governing the admissions to the practice of law here in the Philippines. Okay, then of course we have this concept of we call this si hard law at saka si soft law. Okay. So when we speak of hard law, of course, insofar as international law is concerned, there are rules which are concrete. Okay, so for example, there are rules which are hard law. For example, most of our treaties you can consider them as hard law, so far as it is properly ratified. But there are certain norms and certain principles that may not be non-binding. Okay, so those are which are non-binding. They are considered as soft law. Okay, I think we're going to discuss that as to the sources of obligation. So we'll tackle that more on that subject matter. So this is how we are introducing public international law. Okay,